Alright folks, how you doing? So a few days ago my fellow Scottish YouTuber and West Lothian YouTuber Ged Skeptic put up a video claiming that King Edward Longshanks had a more legitimate claim to the Scottish throne than King Robert the Bruce. And after dwelling on this for a couple of days in the back of my mind, I can only conclude that Ged must either be winding us up, be completely ignorant of Scottish history, or may have been suffering a concussion at the time, or some sort of hallucinogenic influence, because what are you talking about, Ged? There are several things that prove just at the most cursory glance that Longshanks was not a legitimate candidate for the Scottish throne. For one thing, the fact that he had to bully the other Scottish nobles into signing the Ragman Rolls. That in and of itself should have been, you know, I have a philosophy. The greatest evidence in life is what's self-evident. In other words, the greatest evidence is what's blindingly bloomin' obvious, and not what you read in records or transcripts or anything like that. I mean, in other words, action and behaviour provide the greatest evidence over written records and genealogy and things like that. And also the fact that, speaking of records, the fact that King Edward Longshanks destroyed the Scottish records when he invaded the country. We'll get into that in future videos as well. You know, and the basis of Ged's argument seems to have been genealogical, that Longshanks had a connection to Malcolm III Canmore, albeit a fairly distant connection, and that the Bruce family, by the way, it's not the Bruce, it's the Bruce. Learn at least how to pronounce these things, kid. But anyway, the Bruce family snuck their way in through the back door, which is not really a very strong argument. I wouldn't say it was a straw man argument, but in some ways it kind of is, because if he's paying attention to his own video, he himself, if he goes back and looks, Malcolm Canmore married in with an Anglo-Saxon princess, St. Margaret, or Queen Margaret. So the whole thing that the Bruce family married in with Anglo-Saxon royalty and or aristocracy at least, and you know, Scottish aristocracy is a non-starter even by his own logic, because so did Malcolm Canmore. So that doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on. But he's showing a complete ignorance there of how medieval kingship worked. I mean, these days we have democracies where, you know, presidents and prime ministers are voted in. Back in those days that wasn't the case, of course, but the nobility would appoint the king largely, and if the nobility or the aristocracy, or both, because in many ways they're kind of the same thing, not completely but mostly, but if the nobility and the aristocracy and even the church even, I don't know if you've seen Outlaw King, you know, if the nobility, the church and all that disagreed with the monarchy, the king, they could take steps to depose him, or if they wanted to put him in power, they could support him and back him up. So in other words, Robert the Bruce was put into the position of kingship by both the church and by the nobility, or a large part of the nobility, not all of it, because due to Robert the Bruce murdering John Comyn, there was a strong anti-Bruce faction within Scotland, and in effect Robert the Bruce had to effectively conquer or reconquer large swathes of his own land in order to secure his own throne. So his rule over Scotland was precarious in the first year or so, to say the least, and it took him a long time to solidify his rule. So, you know, whether by appointment or by conquest, Robert the Bruce was absolutely the king, you know, and you could make the argument that at first his rule was precarious due to his own actions in murdering John Comyn in the church. Yes, that is absolutely true, but he did win over the nobles in the end, and he couldn't have maintained his position as the king without the support of the nobles. And in fact, one of the things that made Longshanks an illegal ruler of Scotland is the fact that he bullied the noble families into signing the Ragman Rolls, which I alluded to earlier. You know, and I'm not a lawyer by any means. If anyone's listening to this and are engaged in the legal profession or know anything about medieval documents, you know, it does strike me that an agreement made under duress is non-binding, which is why so many nobles such as Robert Boyd, John de Graham and others joined William Wallace when he rose up against King Edward, because they considered their oath to King Edward to be non-binding because it was made under duress. In other words, you know, if you don't agree to appoint me as your overlord, you know, I will confiscate your land and throw you in prison, or may even kill you, or go after members of your family. So what King Edward was doing was little better than mafia tactics, you know, do as we say or we'll burn down your restaurant, basically, or burn down your establishment, we'll take your estates off you and throw you in the poorhouse and imprison members of your family, sort of thing. So, I mean, just the fact alone that Longshanks had to bully the Scottish nobles showed that deep down he knew his claim to the Scottish throne was illegitimate. But I'm going to make a series of videos where I provide insight into King Edward's character. So yeah, look forward to that in the near future.